Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the Insight podcast, Islamic Perspectives on Politics.
Assalamu alaikum. Today I have with me two guests who will be sharing their thoughts and experiences regarding the situation in occupied Palestine. We have Sister Farhana Hussein. She is a mother of four and a homeschooler. She is a pharmaceutical chemist by profession. She is Bangladeshi by origin and is married into a Palestinian family. She has travelled to Jordan and Palestine several times, most recently in 2019, where she visited her extended family in the West Bank and was fortunate enough, alhamdulillah, to be able to visit Al-Aqsa for the second time. Farhana is involved in a variety of community projects and networks. Our second guest, Sister Hanan Hussein, is a mother of two of Palestinian descent and has lived here in the UK for over 35 years. She is also a trained Arabic interpreter and an active advocate for parents with children who have special needs, alhamdulillah. Hanan has travelled to the West Bank many times in her youth and has spent significant periods of time there experiencing the hardships of daily life, most notably when she was there at the very start of the second uprising in the year 2000, and she witnessed the F-16 air attacks and shelling in the West Bank, which is an experience that sadly she'll never forget. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to you both, Farhana and Hanan.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
So just to begin with, at the moment, many of us around the world, we're facing a lockdown of some kind in this pandemic. Can you tell us about the lockdown that our Palestinian brothers and sisters are facing?
رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Yeah, so we've been experiencing this idea of lockdown now for the last couple of months. And truthfully, it's been, really difficult. I think most people have all kind of struggled with the same sort of things, being restricted in your movements for the very first time. Your day-to-day activities have all kind of just come to a halt. It's almost like life is on a kind of pause button. And, simple things like just going to the supermarket is such a struggle now because of the social distancing and the stockpiling that's going on. You just can't get what you need. And everywhere around the world, they're all kind of struggling with the same sort of thing. But if you look at the Muslims of Palestine, of the West Bank and Gaza, this is the norm for them. They've had this kind of restrictions on their movement and, more and more measures to tighten control on every aspect of their life since the very beginning of the occupation. And so, actually Dr. Tariq Zaid al-Kilani of Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, said that what is abnormal for the rest of the world is normal for Palestinians here. So, in terms of the pandemic lockdown, obviously they had that imposed on them as well in the West Bank for 3 weeks, and then there was some gradual easing. In Gaza, they attempted a lockdown, a partial lockdown, and it was just very difficult to uphold because when it came to a choice between, going out to get your food for your, family and the supplies that you need or staying in because of this pandemic lockdown, they obviously chose to go out and get the food for their families because with the blockade already there in Gaza, it makes things already so much more difficult, and if you think about something like social distancing in a place so densely populated, the most densely populated place on earth, the idea of, trying to maintain things like social distancing is also totally impractical and has actually been impossible to uphold.
So you've said that Gaza has faced a blockade for 14 years. Can you just explain to us a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, so officially the blockade has been going on for 14 years now, but actually movement in and out of Gaza has been tightly controlled and restricted since the early 90s. Many years ago, I travelled with a very close friend of mine to the West Bank to visit family there, and she also has family in Gaza as well, and was allowed to enter, due to her British passport, was allowed to enter and cross over the border into Gaza and visit her grandparents who are still living there. Her own aunts and uncles who lived in the West Bank weren't allowed to make that same trip. They were actually not seeing their family in so many years due to the fact that they weren't allowed entry into Gaza, and vice versa, her grandparents weren't allowed to leave Gaza to visit their children. And this is a common story that you'll hear from people who have family in Gaza, and it's something that's been going on for decades, long before the blockade. The blockade has definitely made things more difficult though, so you could see now that the only way into Gaza now is through Egypt, and that border is so tightly controlled both on the Egyptian side and on the Rafah side as well. And, you know, it's closed so much of the time. You have a situation where it's just randomly, you know, closed for a week, then open for a month, closed for a day, then open for a week. Sometimes, you know, the opposite. You have it where it's closed for months on end and then only open for, say, a week or something. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just random. But it makes things obviously very difficult for people who are trying to kind of plan to either visit Gaza or to leave for any reason, to leave Gaza and be able to come back as well. Sometimes they get stuck outside, unable to come back in. So that's people, but then you've got the goods as well, which the exports have obviously been blocked, which has had a devastating effect on the economy of Gaza. Imports, unfortunately, are, you know, so tightly controlled that much of what ends up at the border gets declined and goes back into Egypt. So you have a situation that there is a lack of food coming in, there's a lack of goods, produce, medical supplies, which has had kind of a devastating effect. If you think about the hospitals not getting enough basic pain relief, anaesthetic for surgeries, just thinking of the consequences of that is just really, disastrous. And then you have fuel shortages on top of everything else. You've got, building materials which are not coming in. So infrastructure is totally crumbled because there's not enough building materials and construction materials to kind of think about rebuilding the economy in any way, shape or form. And 18-hour daily power cuts. This is something that, they struggle with. 6 hours of electricity. Imagine all of these things put together, the consequences of that, how difficult it must be. It's led to an unemployment rate of around 40%, which is the highest in the whole world. And all of that, if that's not all bad enough, you've got, on top of all of that, the situation is further compounded with these repeated offensives. So in 2014, we know that the major attack then killed more than 2,200 Palestinians, many of whom were children, and left 65,000 homeless. And after 2 years, only 30% of those homes have actually been rebuilt because of the construction materials not making their way into Gaza. So these are the devastating effects. But what's the reason behind this? Why did they do this? And the first thing that you'll hear is that it was because of the election of Hamas in 2007. And, something we have to know about the people of Gaza, the Muslims of Gaza have always been very firm in stating their rejection of the occupation, of living under the occupation. And, 80% of Gaza's population are in fact refugees. And due to the fact that they're governed by Hamas, who by most are considered a terrorist organization, they've used this as a pretext to the blockade, as the reason for why it was instated on the people of Gaza, which is really, if you look at it, quite a lame excuse, a pathetic excuse, because actually the blockade really exemplifies the overall policy of the Zionist state and their approach to the Palestinians from the very start of the occupation, which is that they are a people who have no right to reside on their own land and to express their own will. And, anytime that they have the audacity to do so, they will be punished, be weakened. And that's what the blockade does. It serves those core goals of expanding the land, consolidating more and more land, and in the process removing any obstacles, like the Palestinians, for example. Now, this is terrorism at a state level. It's important for us to state it as clearly as that, because that's what it is, pure and simple. It ensures that the Muslims of Palestine are constantly weakened and fragmented, physically separated from each other. And, let's look at what the UN has to say on this. So they come out every now and then and declare this blockade as, illegal, unlawful form of collective punishment. But it means nothing in real life. It means absolutely nothing. They've never taken them to task, never made any sort of sanctions to, to kind of take responsibility for what they've done to the Gazan people. In fact, they continue to open their arms to them, welcoming them. And, if you look, it's actually an ally of most of the Security Council member countries. So what we see is that it's enjoying full diplomatic relations, and it's able to basically subject the Gazans, 2 million Muslims, to terror with impunity.
So we're experiencing Ramadan in lockdown at the moment, and I think it's been challenging in a number of different ways for many of us. Can you just tell us a bit about what Ramadan is like at the moment for the Muslims in Palestine, and what sort of challenges are they facing?
رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. The word occupied, I think, sums it up rather well, because what you're talking about is essentially what is Ramadan like in a permanent state of occupation. When you have a situation where people are living everyday life that's been, disrupted throughout the year, you can't expect Ramadan to be the same for them, not under these kind of circumstances. Ramadan is such a blessed time for us in the year, subhanAllah. We feel that we're experiencing something special together as an ummah. And, alhamdulillah, is something we look forward to. It's a sense of renewed energy. But for the Muslims of Palestine, I would say that Ramadan actually highlights the difficulties that they actually face, on a day-to-day basis. So currently, for the Muslims that are living in the West Bank, the masajids are still closed because of this whole coronavirus lockdown. But even outside of this pandemic, what does Ramadan look like? Ramadan is still encased by occupation, and this is a fact that you cannot get away from. Now, as a rule, you'll find that Palestinians aren't able to leave the West Bank without a special permit. So even an hour's car journey, say, or less even, you're most likely to get stopped. To be able to go and pray at Masjid al-Aqsa, you will need to get a special permission. And even then, there is no guarantee if you're going to get in or not. Ramadan is different for us this year too. We're also facing lockdown. Nevertheless, we're doing this because there is a virus. So our masajids, they are closed. Taraweeh has been cancelled. Jummah has been cancelled. It is frustrating to be able to do the normal things like just food shopping. I mean, who wants to wait in Tesco's for an hour? But now think for a moment that this is your life throughout the year. You require permission to move around freely, even if it's just to go and visit and pray Salah at Masjid al-Aqsa. I think it's important to remember that we're talking about the third holiest site after Mecca and Medina. Yet most of the Palestinians who don't live in Jerusalem, they will never be able to visit, which for us who have been able to visit twice now from the UK, there is a sense of guilt that we were able to go, whereas people who are living, just there, they will never see it. Most of my husband's family who live outside of Jerusalem will never see it. You've then got this added issue of settlers. And it was only just last Ramadan, in fact, in 2019, during the last 10 days, that hordes of settlers were allowed to come into a Masjid al-Aqsa compound with full protection and authority. They stormed the area, and all of it was done under complete supervision. We were in fact there last summer, the week before Eid al-Adha, and settlers again, they were allowed to come into the compound with police supervision. And from what I could see, it was just to state their presence. They wanted to make a point that they can and they will do whatever they want to. We were talking to an old uncle as well, and he was explaining to us how, and some of your listeners might even know about this, but for years now they've been building tunnels underground the Aqsa complex, and you can even see movement within the concrete tiles. So there is definitely a sense of, the Zionists encroaching around you. We felt it. It's aggravating, it's uncomfortable. But the fact is that we don't live there, but they do. So this point about what Ramadan is like for people in the West Bank in terms of the challenges, well, it's really like the rest of the year. Can they really escape the control, the oppression and humiliation? It does not stop.
And what about Ramadan in Gaza? Can you just talk to us a little bit about what Ramadan is like there at the moment?
Yes, it's definitely felt very different this Ramadan. There's no doubt about that. I think we knew we were going into lockdown. We would be going into Ramadan during this lockdown, this pandemic lockdown, and we kind of thought it would be different and would not be the same, and we'd miss many aspects. And I think that's definitely been true. The whole of Ramadan really felt the lack of Salat al-Taraweeh at the masjid, Qiyam sometimes within the community, iftars with our families and our communities, even going to more Islamic events sometimes that are, specific to Ramadan, Qiyams, that they do at the masjid and things like that, which we are really, missing, especially Salat al-Tarawih. And that's the same for the Muslims in Gaza as well. They, we spoke recently to family who live there, and they really are feeling quite sad without Salat al-Tarawih. But important to really understand and talk about the fact that, in Gaza, actually, they're used to so much more sadness than even what we've experienced during this kind of unprecedented Ramadan that we've had during the lockdown. And if we just look back at the last 2 Ramadans in Gaza, which began with brutal attacks on protesters that were participating in the March for Return at the border of Gaza and the rest of the country, and we saw how, indiscriminately people were being shot at regardless, even health workers who'd come to tend to the casualties ended up being shot and killed. And, during a whole year of protests, there was 28,666 injured and 190 were killed. So, kind of, if you look, actually, Ramadan in Gaza has always been marked by tragedy and death and burying their dead. And, looking back at 2014, this major attack, which also took place in Ramadan, and remembering, I don't know if you remember, but I can never forget those pictures of Eid day, Eid morning, seeing those children on the swings shot dead on Eid morning in Gaza. So these are images that will never leave us. And so this is something that it's important for us to kind of remember when we want to remember our brothers and sisters in Gaza this year, during our iftars, during our suhoors, during our salah, when we make dua, when we stay up for qiyam al-layl, when we stay up on Laylatul Qadr, and also when we talk to our children. We talk to our families, we talk to, maybe we can't get round to everybody because it's difficult this year. We're doing a lot of virtual talking on Zoom and whatnot, but speaking to whoever we can, reminding each other of our brothers and sisters in Gaza and our children in Gaza as well. We do so much for our children. Our children are, at iftar asking what we're having for dessert, and we want to give it to them because they've been fasting. We want to reward them, we want to give that to them, but to remind them when we talk to our children, to remind them also of their brothers and sisters in Gaza, of the children in Gaza, our children in Gaza, who, if we look at a UN report that says 70% of the people in Gaza do not have enough food to eat. They are considered by this UN report to be moderately to severely food insecure. And then looking at, when we're breaking our fasts, talking to our children about that, talking to our families about that, how it is to be lacking food, to be hungry even after a day of fasting. And then, when we break our iftar and we have those first few sips of water as well, to remember that 90% of the water in Gaza is actually undrinkable, unfit to drink, which means that every time, just think about that, how devastating the implication of that is. Every time they, take a few sips of water, they're seriously risking their health. And so it's not surprising then when we find out in 2012 a UN report which painted such a grim and bleak picture of Gaza and how it would keep deteriorating under this blockade, and describing it to be a place which would be unlivable by 2020. Well, here we are, we're now in 2020, my dear sisters, and this is something for us to really stop and think about, especially, during these last blessed days of Ramadan, and remember them in our du'as, remember them at all times, our brothers and sisters in Gaza, and the suffering that they're going through.
Many of us around the world were so very aware of the poverty that's facing our brothers and sisters in Gaza. And it's this month of Ramadan, we are at our most charitable, and we're giving more and more to causes like these. Do you think that we need to give more to alleviate this problem?
I would like to start off by saying that, mashallah, Muslims do not have any issues giving sadaqah. This is just not our challenge. And I'd even go as far as saying that Muslims are the best at giving sadaqah. You know, in the UK, we actually break records every year in the amount that we are able to donate as a community. Alhamdulillah. And especially in Ramadan, you know, when we know that the hasanat is so much more, there's no holding back in giving. So first and foremost, as a Muslim, I would say that giving in the name of Allah is for our own akhirah. And there is a beautiful hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that I'd like to share. When he says that the believer's shade on the day of their resurrection will be his charity. And he also says in another hadith where he describes charity as the extinguisher of sins, subhanAllah. You'll even find in the Quran as well that Allah mentions that giving to the needy around 70 times. So it's pretty clear that it's such an important action for a Muslim. So my first reply to your question is yes, absolutely. We should be striving to give more of what we have to those in need, especially like our brothers and sisters in Gaza. But I think we also need to be very clear that there is two issues here. Giving sadaqah is separate from understanding the actual causes of poverty in Gaza. And I think this is the point that we seem to miss sometimes.
Hanan, would you like to add anything?
The poverty in Gaza is by design. You know, it's very, very important for us to understand, I think, that the strategy that's being used in Gaza is, is something that we see. You know, we see the occupier has created this kind of situation to ensure that it maintains this really tight hold, a stranglehold, if you like, on those it occupies, which in this situation is the Palestinians of Gaza, the Muslims of Gaza. Because we can see, you know, that the poverty is a direct link to the blockade. We can see it's a direct outcome of an economy which has been really crumbled, broken down due to the blockade on exports and on imports as well. We have a situation where the revenue that they would normally have got, and they did used to get, and they had a very strong infrastructure out of agriculture and fishing, has all been lost. I think the World Bank says it's around 83% of the gross national product is lost due to the blockade on, revenue that they would have normally got through, exporting both agricultural produce and fishery as well. And these are strong sources of income for Gaza, which have been, literally they've been blocked for them. Yeah, so we see that it's a cycle of poverty that is created, it's engineered. It's not something that's just come out of nowhere. It isn't because they're riddled with debt or they can't sustain themselves. It is something that has been created and is being enabled by that mechanism, by the occupation. The only way, therefore, to really address that poverty is to address the root cause, which is the occupation. And there's so many other examples. There's a mile wide buffer zone, which has now been designated as a buffer zone. It's a piece of land just inside the border of Gaza, and this land is one of the best arable land that Gaza has, and they're unable now to work that land because it's been designated as a buffer zone. So just that piece of land is estimated 75,000 tons of produce is being lost every year. And so it's all part of that same strategy. The strategy of the Zionist occupation has always been to keep the Palestinians just barely existing. And, let me share with you an example, actually, by their own NGOs, that was published by their own NGO. Gisha released some information years back on how in the early years of the siege, it would calculate what is the minimum number of calories for Palestinians in Gaza to survive? What would they need to survive? And they would use those figures then to determine how much food aid should be allowed to be trucked into Gaza. So just imagine, it's like literally keeping the territory on life support. Any aid that we do give will be of some help. It will alleviate the symptoms at least. And we know that. And it's important to give, as Muslims. But we just need to be clear that we're not addressing the root of the problem, the cause of the perpetual cycle of poverty, that we know as savvy, politically minded Muslims, which is what we should be. We shouldn't be naive, that When we give, we're giving to alleviate the symptoms of our brothers and sisters' suffering. The children of Gaza, they're suffering. But to know that to truly put an end to this cycle of poverty, to truly put an end to the suffering, we have to address the cause of the poverty. And in this situation, very clearly, the cause of the poverty is the occupation. So therefore, the means to remove this engineered state of poverty and to actually end this perpetual cycle is to remove the very mechanism which caused it and enables it.
So what about Muslim countries? Do you think that they should be doing more for Gaza?
This is quite a big topic in and of its own, so I will just touch on some key points, inshallah. Firstly, I think we need to state categorically that Muslim countries in the surrounding region that are around Palestine are nothing other than traitors, outright traitors. And I can't stress this point enough. They didn't just abandon the cause after the 1967 war. They have been part and parcel and complicit in continuing the normalization with the Zionist entity. So, for example, Turkey, they were one of the first nations to formally recognize the Zionist state as a state. They have alliances militarily, strategically, and they've stated quite openly the importance of both countries having diplomatic relations. So how can this be the case when they fully comprehend the tragedy that's unfolding in that region? So on the face of it, they'll condemn the actions of the Zionists, but these words really mean nothing when their actions are so deafening. Another example would be the Saudis. I mean, shockingly, they've gone as far as saying, in not so many words, that the Palestinians need to get over it, that they need to accept it. Accept what exactly? They need to accept the occupation? Well, recently they've announced their full support for Trump's plan of allowing even more land to be stolen in the West Bank. We were talking about the Gaza blockade before and the increasing level of poverty that they face. I mean, this problem has been absolutely compounded by the treachery of the Egyptian government. They have unashamedly closed their borders with Gaza. They've destroyed the underground tunnels. You know, these tunnels that were the lifeline for these people. You even find that when you're crossing the border, as we did from Jordan to get into Palestine, apart from being greeted by armed police, inside you see hanging huge framed photos of Muslim leaders from Jordan, Egypt, Palestine, embracing, shaking hands with old and new Zionist leaders. You know, it's subtle, but it sends a message. So this question about Muslim countries and are they able to do more, I think you can tell just from a few of these examples that the behavior of these Muslim states towards our brothers and sisters in Palestine, their actions speaks volumes. They are colluding directly with the Zionists. They are harming the Muslims with their own hands. How does this behavior sit when we believe that a Muslim does not forsake his brother? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah.
So we all do know the Palestinian territories are sort of fragmented and they're split into what we know as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Would you say that life is better for those in the West Bank?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked about the West Bank. I wanted to share a little bit of my experiences as well. But before we go into that, I would like to talk a little bit about viewing the occupation in three broad areas. You have the extreme end of it, which are the Muslims in Gaza. And, you know, it's very clear that they live under extreme occupation. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the Palestinians that are living directly in occupied area, and they tend to have a better quality of life. This is quite well known. They benefit from the infrastructure. However, they are still looked on with suspicion and treated as second-class citizens. And you can't forget the psychological impact of knowing that either side of them, Palestinians, their own family members, they live under severe occupation. So the West Bank, albeit more open and free in terms of movement in comparison to Gaza, it's all relative, they still face humiliation every single day. where you've got thousands of workers being at the mercy of the occupiers to go and do something simple, just, like earning a living. So the first time we went to Palestine, we entered Jerusalem through one of the checkpoints across the wall. And this resembled, and I'm not exaggerating, like a huge cowshed with metal railings to separate people into lines, metal gates that you have to cross. And then you obviously have the guards that are waiting for you on the other side, letting you in. One person at a time. Even my small children, they want to check your bags, they want to check your belongings. The whole situation is very humiliating. I mean, my parents were with me, and I think for them especially, they'd never experienced anything like this in their life. And I think until you've been there and seen it with your own eyes, it's very different to how you view things when you watch it on TV or read about it in the newspapers. The whole process is mentally draining if you imagine doing this on a daily basis. So moving on, all the areas in the West Bank, they are supposedly under the authority of the PNA, which is the Palestinian National Authority. The irony is that in reality, how does it look? They are ultimately in a continuous lockdown. So as I mentioned before, there is no free movement in and out of the West Bank. You need to get a permit to get through. Then you have the separation wall. This separation wall, it surrounds much of occupied East Jerusalem. It cuts off approximately 250,000 of its Palestinian residents from the rest of the occupied West Bank. The consequences being that it is separating families. It makes access to employment extremely difficult. In the West Bank alone, you have over 700 permanent obstacles that basically prevent free movement. So you have Palestinian workers that have to go through checkpoints like the one that I described before. Even outside of Jerusalem, you're going to get stopped. There is more and more Zionist presence as a result of the settlements as well. So we were stopped a few times. They took our passports, even the children's passports. They want to check them. They ask us questions. And I do feel that it's just to make us feel annoyed, to kind of put us off coming again. Because at the end of the day, when you're going on a holiday, you can put up with some difficulties for a week. It's not a problem. The idea that this is your life is a different situation completely. You might also come across roadblocks, earth mounds they have. And this leads to such, long-term economic problems. My husband's cousin, who is a senior nurse, he lives in the West Bank and he travels to Jerusalem for work. And he was describing to us about the way that the border crossings work. Such stringent rules. I mean, the journey that he takes is just fraught with difficulties. So many delays. You have to have the right paperwork. If you don't have the right paperwork, you can get rejected, or they'll just make you wait for hours on end. And this is just one example that we know of firsthand. There are so many other examples. There are so many other Palestinians that are forced to undertake this kind of long and difficult journey due to the reality of the occupation. Then you have the control of water, which is a basic necessity, yet it's another method that is used to control those living in the West Bank. So the Zionists, they restrict Palestinian access to water in the occupied territories to the level that it's, nowhere near enough for them. It's not even close to a fair distribution. And even worse than this, the terrorist state actually controls the distribution of rainwater. Rain that Allah has sent down for you, for everyone. They actually destroy the rainwater harvesting systems. These are owned by Palestinian communities. And what you find is that the Palestinians that live in the rural areas especially, they have no access to running water. So I think it's quite clear that just from some of these examples that I've given, that the control that is enforced over every aspect of life, the whole entire machinery of the Zionist state, it's completely geared towards making sure that the Palestinians remain deprived, that they remain disadvantaged and in a constant state of hardship. Many of my husband's nephews, they are studying dentistry, they're becoming lawyers, they're becoming physiotherapists, and other professions. And what you find is that because of the fact that there's lack of work or professional work within the West Bank, they do consider leaving. And again, this is another tactic that they use, as a lot of them have to resort to labour work in the occupied state.
So looking at the economic difficulties, in Ramadan, most of us end up breaking our fast with Palestinian dates, Palestinian produce. And I guess in the last decade or so, there's been like a huge push to protect Palestinian farms, their produce, things like labelling dates and making sure that we're buying the right produce from the right areas. How important do you think it is for us as Muslims to sort of support these initiatives?
Alhamdulillah, I really think that the Muslim community does do a lot to support the Palestinian cause, and I think that they view it as an obligation to do so. There really is, mashallah, such a concerted effort to avoid buying Zionist produce. It's definitely a rewardable action, and it shows loyalty. Many scholars, actually, even though there are some who differ in opinion, they've adopted the view that it's forbidden to buy Zionist produce like dates and olives, etc., because of the fact that it's all grown on stolen land. Has the boycott had an effect? People might ask. Alhamdulillah, the boycott on dates have shown to have some negative effect, but it's similar to the question about how to alleviate the poverty in Gaza. You've got to get to the root of it. This is just a minimum, really, that we should be doing. So I would say that in regards to this issue in particular, I think we need to again, separate good and the much needed action of boycotting from the actual causes. We need to consider that what are the actual solutions to lifting the problem? What is actually affecting these Palestinian farmers? And really, without a shadow of a doubt, the problem is caused by these illegal settlements. They are an integral part of the occupation strategy. So these settlements are basically like small villages where everything from water, the roads, any other resources that are from Palestinians, they are basically redirected towards their settlements. And this is irrespective of what the effect is going to have for the people. They've kind of ignored the map of the West Bank, and they've just sort of established themselves wherever they see fit. So I just want you to imagine that you have an area, the West Bank, which is supposedly for the Palestinians, and then you're saying that within this area that's basically restricted, almost completely. It's closed off. You have well over 600,000 settlers, and the numbers are growing. Most of these settlers have come from Europe and America, and these settlements are scattered throughout the West Bank. So one of the largest settlements, in fact, is populated by about 30,000. We saw this when we went to go and see my husband's aunt's house. We could see the settlement from the roof. It was very, very, very wide, and that's considered to be like a small village. And these are built on what the Zionists call expropriated land, basically land that's been directly taken from the Palestinians and then legally sanctioned by court. So it's very similar to what happened in the Nakba. What do these settlements mean now for the Palestinians? Well, what you find is that, as I mentioned before, water is redirected, new roads are built, therefore you have new checkpoints. And because now you have roads that are within Palestinian territories, they lead off to the settlements. So these roads are therefore not safe anymore for the Palestinians to drive through, because the amount of presence now you're going to have from the Zionist police to protect these roads, inadvertently protecting the settlements. What you find is that these settlements might even place their drainages close to the roads or close to Palestinian areas. And also these settlers are dressed as normal people, plain-clothed civilians that carry firearms, and they will freely enter into areas of the West Bank, or what you would say these communal areas. When we were there last year, there was definitely an increase in the number that we saw. We definitely sensed that, and you could sense that as a result of settlers moving in, there was more and more presence of the Zionist forces, the occupying forces. Now, in terms of these lands that have been seized, we are talking about hundreds of kilometers of roads that's all been taken up by the settlers. It's only for their use. So, what does this mean for the Palestinians? Especially the Palestinian farmers. They have no access to a lot of their farmland because these farmlands now fall within settlements or they fall outside of them. Okay, so imagine like a farmland and you have a settlement that sort of crosses through, or a road that crosses through. So the farmers can't actually access their farmland in the way that they need to. They can't carry out the work. Therefore, they can't fertilize, they can't do any weeding. So this type of upheaval, it totally disrupts their whole livelihood. The settlers, they don't like to keep themselves to themselves. They're actually part of this Zionist machinery. They employ systematic attacks on the Palestinian crops. They burn olive trees, especially when the harvest just arrives, when the farmers are basically ready to go and pick them. So, what are we talking about here? We're talking about institutionalized destruction of Palestinian agriculture. Unless this occupying state is removed, you can't protect the farmers, or at least you can't protect the farmers effectively. And this is despite our efforts.
So where would you say the PNA is in all of this? Surely all of this is going on in areas that they control.
I think it's really important to be really clear on the fact that the only ones that have any authority or any control on the situation at hand are the Zionists. The Palestinian Authority ironically administers a measly 39% of the West Bank. 61% of the West Bank remains under the direct control of the Zionist military and the civilian control. So the West Bank is divided into 3 areas, A, B, and C. And when you actually break down the details of each area, what you find is the only area where the Palestinian Authority have full civil administrative responsibility, i.e. running municipal governments, courts, schools, these kind of areas, it's only really in Area A. And Area A has never exceeded more than 18% of the West Bank, which is quite laughable. This reminds me of a conversation we had with my husband's nephew. He was taking us to an area close to Jenin to visit family. And he was explaining to us about these 3 areas. And this was the first time I'd actually heard about it, whereas for them it was quite well known. The Palestinian Authority is seen to be a group that has completely sold out. And so the resistance has become weak because you don't have that support. So his nephew said categorically, they have no control. 18% was considered to be totally negligible. In fact, the Palestinian Authority works for the occupiers and they, in order to keep the people subdued. Then you have the fact that the Palestinian Authority, and again, the irony, it does lack any authority over the settlers, the settlements. It lacks authority over any of its borders. And we're talking about airspace. We talked about water before. There are many spheres. And even if the Palestinian Authority wanted to put something forward, the Zionists will review it and they can veto it. So what does that actually mean for the Palestinian Authority? What do they actually do? At best, an admin body. It's got no control, no territorial control. That's exactly how the Zionists like to keep things. It's the only way to maintain their stranglehold. So Naftali Bennett, head of the Jewish Home Party in 2013, and he said quite clearly in an interview that there is not going to be a Palestinian state within this tiny state. And he said, referring to the area from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, it's just not going to happen. A Palestinian state would be a disaster for the next 200 years. And he is now the 2020 Defence Minister.
So from everything that we've discussed, we as Muslims, we can often feel very disheartened looking at the situation of our brothers and sisters in Palestine. It seems to get worse every year. Do you think that there's any hope?
Well, firstly, sisters, let's remember what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about this, what he says to us in the Quran, in Surah Ali Imran, verse 139, he says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَلَا تَهِنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. Do not lose heart nor fall into despair. You shall triumph if you are believers. So there is always hope, sisters. There's always hope, and there must never be despair. Because actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us in this ayah that despair is not of the characteristics of the believers. So, what better example do we have than actually who we've been talking about today? Let's just look at the Muslims of Gaza, for example, who generation after generation, they've only known the refugee camps as their homes. And yet, they're still protesting. They still raise their voices and speak the haqq as they know it. They, know that they're risking their lives when they do this, but they do it because they will never accept this occupation. And so they continue to protest and raise their voice and speak this, this fact, speak it loud. We refuse this occupation. We refuse to live under it. And, we as the Muslims here in the West, we want to be their support system. We want to be their backbone here. We don't risk our lives in the same way. So let's raise our voices even louder than theirs. Yeah? Or at least as loud as theirs. So to do that, though, we have to see how it is that we can really be clear that we're speaking with one voice, with our ummah there. And I think it's important to actually really address some of our key thoughts about the situation, to make sure that we're clear on it, that we grasp it fully. And one of the things, number one, I would say that is really important for us to kind of address, which is also very simple, is the fact that we do refuse this occupation. We do reject this state. We, consider it to be an illegitimate state. And therefore, we have to be very clear. We don't hesitate when we say this. If we look, do they hesitate when they speak about the homeland? Do we see them grappling with the issue of, this is their homeland? No. From Netanyahu down to the school children, they don't. They say this is our homeland. So us as Muslims, we should be even stronger, more confident even, when we say what we know to be the haqq, the truth. Because yes, it's a reality, and I think this is the stumbling block, that we see that it's here, so we can't just keep saying, we don't accept this state or it's a legitimate state, because it's here. It is here. It exists. But how did it exist? Because part of that reality of how it exists is how it came to be. And how it came to be was through ruthless, vicious means, through killing and displacing of Muslims, through creating a refugee problem that is unknown by the world till today. 7 million refugees worldwide. And that's how it came to be. That's part of the reality. So rejecting the state and rejecting the occupation, it has to be with that in mind, that we don't accept it because it was forced upon the land of the Muslims, and it must be returned now to the Muslims. Yeah. Number two, and this is very important, is linked to the first one, is understanding the timeline, because it started in 1948. That's when the occupation happened. That is the inception of the state. So therefore, our discussions and our rejection and our refusal to accept this occupation must be from that point, must be from 1948. We have to be very careful, because I think there is this discussion about the 1967 borders, and most, discussions, they do center around that. 1967 borders, because that's when it's considered to have been breaking UN resolutions. But for us, this is Islamic land, this is blessed land, and it was taken in 1948. So we must understand that for us, the discussion centers around 1948. Any land, not even an inch, must be, returned to the Muslims. So the discussion of extra land in 1967, all the settlements or all this kind of stuff that they discuss, all these contraventions, these are not our issue. We start from 1948. This is when the criminal act happened, for us. So to be clear on that as well, inshallah. And number three, and I think this is probably the most important one, is to clarify in our minds that, when we look at these peace deals and proposals which have been inspired by the Western states and inspired by, these organizations, that in fact we are colluding with other than Allah. Look at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, The parable of those who seek allies and protectors from other than Allah is that of a spider who builds a house. But indeed the weakest of houses is the spider's house, if they but knew. And subhanAllah, this verse is so apt. This ayah is so, perfect for us, because we've been doing that. We've been looking towards the West. We've been looking towards the UN and all these other self-appointed mediators. And where has it gotten us? Nowhere. In fact, things are so much worse. So much worse than what they were. And so this is because we are going against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us in the Quran regarding this issue.
So are you saying that any sort of peace process is just not workable?
Well, let's have a look at what we've got so far. So in the 90s, we had the Oslo Accords. And according to this, control over the West Bank was supposed to be handed over to the Palestinians. And as we've talked about earlier, this actually didn't happen. In the end, the West Bank was divided into 3 areas, and the majority of the territory ended up under occupation control, and still is until today. Then after this, we had the Camp David talks. And then a few years later, there was the Quartet Roadmap Plan. Now, all these talks and all these negotiations have all presumed a certain goal, which has been the 2-state solution. That's the where they would like to finally settle on their peace plan. And that has always underpinned all these talks, the 2-state solution. Something which in reality has no reality. It's absolutely fantastical as a solution. It's something that, just makes no sense whatsoever. It's ludicrous. The idea that there can be a Palestinian state that exists within the Zionist state. Yeah? The idea of any state existing within another state just doesn't make any sense. And, it's something that's been, unfortunately, sold as a lie that's kind of conveniently been accepted as a way to continue what is already happening, which is the occupation. It's a way to continue those initial, goals, those core goals that the inception of the state and the occupation started with, which is expansion, consolidating more and more land. So we can see this. We can see this through even the new deal of the century, which is just planning on annexing another 30 to 40% of the West Bank and putting it again under the control of the occupation. So, look at it. Let's look at this 2-state solution. Look at it a bit more deeply. Understand it so we know how ludicrous it really is. It's a case of having snippets of land that are scattered all over the country, separated, and, taking up only about 1/5 of the land of, in terms of per square meter of the current Zionist state in terms of land area, has no army, have no control over their airspace and the seas. Would you call this a state? Would you accept this as a state? Of course not. It's, it's ridiculous. It's a lie. And unfortunately, it's been sold now for decades, this idea of a 2-state solution. And, we've got to go back to this understanding of relying on these plans is like the description Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us of the spider's web. It can be blown away, literally destroyed in an instant. And it becomes nothing, in a moment. So we would never put our hope or trust in these plans or even, trust these organizations, because this is what it comes down to. We have to understand that to take the ally of our enemy as our ally is nonsensical. And this is what's happening when we rely on these plans or when we entertain these plans or these negotiations. And all these so-called negotiations, all of these peace talks have been based upon the same premise, which is that this state has a right to exist upon the land of Palestine, upon Palestine, upon Muslim land. And that's the starting point of all the negotiations. And so, this is something, since that's a point that we're rejecting, that the fact that this occupation is illegal, it's illegitimate, the state that has been conceived is illegitimate, then we can't really entertain these discussions at all. We can't actually enter into a discussion where the starting point is that this state should continue to exist upon the land of the Muslims. So any solution that we would discuss would start with the idea that we would be removing the physical occupation of the Zionist state.
So, Farhana, would you say that the numerous problems that our brothers and sisters are facing in Palestine can't be addressed as long as this occupation exists?
I would just like to add and reiterate that all the problems we are aware of that causes the Palestinians to suffer, they are as a direct result of actual occupation. Occupation, control, subjugation. And I think we have to realise that there will be no final settlement. Well, at least not one which could ever be reached. I mean, the Zionist state doesn't want a final settlement. This is quite clear. It is only looking for expansion, and you can tell this by their actions, and you can tell this by their words. So if I were to just give you one last example, as we speak, the Zionist state is actually planning to annex more areas of the West Bank, and this is quite recent. You know, these areas which are according to international law and previous negotiations, not that these things mean anything, they are considered to be unlawfully occupied, and they were supposed to be handed over to the Palestinians a long time ago. If you actually saw these areas that they're going to be bringing under the direct control, subhanallah, you know, they are the most fertile agricultural lands within the Jordan Valley. And this is not even the worst part. The most horrendous thing is that the move is actually in line with this so-called peace plan. This peace plan that was revealed by Trump in January 2020. He calls it the deal of the century. You know, some of you may have heard about it. So the question is, we need to really wake up. You have to be able to see the situation for what it is. You have to be able to see what it is that we're dealing with. You know, you would never enter into any type of negotiation with a burglar who's broken into your home and then wants to negotiate with you what they can steal and what they can't steal. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says to us in Surah An-Nisa, and what is wrong with you that you fight not in the cause of Allah and for those weak, ill-treated and oppressed among men, women and children, whose cry is, our Lord, rescue us from this town whose people are oppressors, and raise for us from you one who will protect, and raise for us from you one who will help. And this is verse 75. This ayah was not revealed just for the Muslims. It was revealed for the whole of mankind. So the obligation to stand and protect against oppression is an Islamic obligation.
Okay, can we just end with, if you just give us a few words about what do you think our brothers and sisters in Palestine should expect from us, Muslims who don't live in that region?
Inshallah, my sisters, they can expect from us what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects from us. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us in a well-known hadith, the Muslim is a brother to another Muslim. He does not wrong him, nor surrenders him. Whoever fulfills the needs of his brother, Allah will fulfill his needs. Whoever relieves a Muslim from distress, Allah will relieve him from distress on the day of resurrection. Whoever covers the faults of a Muslim, Allah will cover his faults on the day of resurrection. So we have to support our brothers and sisters in Palestine. The Muslims of Palestine, the Muslims of Gaza, they need us. They need us to be their voice, to stand alongside them, to be their support system here in the West. You know, they do so. Let's take our inspiration from them. Their steadfastness in speaking the haqq, even when it's a threat on their lives to do so. They don't fear, you know, the repercussions. So us, we don't have those same issues. Let's definitely raise our voices at least to support them. And we have to stand by this cause, because this is not a Palestinian cause. We need to really be clear on this. It's not a Palestinian cause. It's not an Arab issue. This is an issue for the Muslims. It is a political issue, and it's linked to our very belief. It's linked to our iman, because it concerns the third holiest site in Islam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Isra, Ayah 1, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلة من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله لنريه من آياتنا إنه هو السميع البصير. Exalted is he who took his servant by night from Al-Masjid al-Haram to Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, whose surroundings we have blessed to show him of our signs. Indeed, he is the hearing, the seeing. So, you know, sisters, let's raise our voices. This is what the least we can do, is to speak about their suffering, talk about it, talk about the Zionist policies and what they've led to. You know, look at all the things we've discussed today, the situation, the poverty in Gaza, the suffering of our Muslim brothers and sisters in Palestine and Gaza, and the fact that these governments, these Muslim governments, are sitting idly by, watching as this is happening, doing nothing, betraying their own brothers and sisters. And also when we speak about what needs to be done to solve this problem, when we talk about the solution, we have to be confident in speaking the truth of the matter. Get right to the crux of the matter, which is the rejection of this occupation. Yeah, we can't be fearful about stating this confidently. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Imran, verse 175, that it is shaitan who tells us to fear his awliya, shaitan who tells us to fear his supporters. And we can't fall prey to listening to shaitan.
So do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I would just like to add lastly that there is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he says that no Muslim servant supplicates for his brother behind his back, but that the angel says, and for you the same. So we need to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We need to be precise and consistent in what we utter. We must ask Allah to expose the so-called lie of the peace plan, which has been repeatedly sold by these sellout nations. And instead, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the complete liberation of this land, its rightful return to being governed by Islam and the Muslims, inshallah.
I would like to thank Sisters Farhana and Hanan for joining me today. Your thoughts and experiences about Palestine have been so insightful, subhanallah. Jazak Allah Khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast and you'd like to hear more from the Insight team, then please visit our Facebook and Instagram pages and find us on YouTube. And please like, share and subscribe.